Hello, hello, hello. It's Holly Rustick here with Grant Writing and Funding. And I'm super excited today as we are going to be talking about logic models and evaluation sections in your grant applications. And to assist in all of that, I have an expert on the show today, Dr. James Pann. Hey, James, how you doing today?
Good to be back. It's nice to see you and to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is evaluation and everything related to evaluation. So
I love it. I love it. Yeah. Because I mean, I like it too, but that's not my strongest point. So I love that you're coming in and that's like your forte because, you know, it's really important that when we're writing your grant applications and if you have to write an evaluation section that you know what you're doing. It's not just like, it's going to get done. Like there has to be a plan behind it. And you break it down so well. And I know you've touched on it before in the podcast because you've been on the pod before, but today we're going to go a little deeper in and you're really going to be talking more about connecting the logic model. So lots of questions also on logic models. So you guys are definitely going to want to tune in and hang out today and hear this. So thanks again for coming back on the show.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, logic models are oftentimes required. A lot of federal grants, some foundation grants and so forth will require logic models. They sometimes have the layout, the format might change, might vary different depending on which opportunity, which agency. Looking at one right now where they use terms in the RFA or in the NOFA that's quite very different than what I'm used to, but you gotta just have to go with it. So, but foundationally, like if you know how to use a logic model, then you can make adjustments, you can tailor the style, the format, that sort of thing to the particular opportunity.
Yes.
Which is important, right?
Yeah.
So like in this one opportunity we're looking at, they use the term output and outcome, those two terms, which both begin with an O, but they mean something quite different. They use it interchangeably, or they kind of mix it up in the NOFA. And so, but you know, still in the logic model that we'll need to create, we'll have to follow kind of like what their descriptions are. We'll have to, you know, be consistent with how they kind of lay it out. So foundationally, if you understand how to create a logic model, then you understand how to explain succinctly what your program is. You understand how to show what the program is, how to show what it isn't. By creating a logic model, it's not just a great like brainstorming tool, a communication tool, but it's also a fantastic way to figure out then how are we going to like evaluate this program? Like what are the key things that we have to look at to see if those things change, what happens with those different elements so we can really identify this in order to have a meaningful evaluation. So for evaluation purposes as well. So it's like a neat thing, and it works a lot of the times. It's not a panacea. It's not, you know, perfect. When you have more complex programs, then there's other approaches and maybe would be better, different ways to do logic models as well. But your typical approach, typical intervention, program, project, initiative that you're applying for with your federal grants, logic models will work well.
Yeah.
It will help the reviewer really understand what the program is, and you can create it in such a way that it will complement the narrative. So if you have reviewers that are very visual, although, you know, reviewers tend to be they're reviewers, so they read a lot and they're okay with that. But the visual part can really complement and fill in missing pieces and really just kind of like, you know, deliver the essence of the program to someone when they look at that. So creating a logic model has a lot of advantages. A lot of evaluators talk about it, do it for good reason, because it's a useful tool.
Yes, absolutely. And, you know, it's great that we're just diving right into the logic model part because, you know, a lot of people might be like, well, what is a logic model specifically? And how you're kind of outlining it is a visual representation of what's going to be done in the program, right? And there's very specific things to put inside the logic model. But I love that you go back and you say, but first read the FOA, the funding opportunity announcement, right? So, or the request for proposal. And if they do require a logic model, you'll know because they'll put it in there. And sometimes they have their certain format of what they want you to design it like. Sometimes they don't, right? So
Yeah.
this is really good. And even I tell grant writers, even if they don't require a logic model, but you have the opportunity to have it as an attachment or put it, you have page limitation where you actually have a page available where you can put a logic model, include it, because just like you said, it gives another complementary viewpoint of your program and how it's brought together, i.e. there's logic to it, logic model, right? So yeah, can you just kind of talk about them, like on a basic level, then what would all be included in this logic, this one page kind of illustrative, logic model?
Yeah, so that's right. I'll just talk about it. Let's actually kind of get down to what's included. So like the typical pieces that are included a logic model, you oftentimes it's a kind of a visual description, in that you lay the text out that using blocks or using like I'll share one with you, and you can include it in the blog post. Just as
Awesome.
an example.
Mhm.
But the main elements include inputs, or also which are resources, basically the resources that need to go into your project to make it happen. So it could be the funding, it could be the staff, the location, maybe some sort of curriculum that you're going to be using, incorporating right into the program. So those are the inputs, the resources. The activities are the things you're going to do. Oftentimes those are the services we're going to provide. Maybe products we'll develop. Sometimes you develop a manual, a treatment manual or something like that. And that's a part of the, you're not bringing it in, you're actually developing it as part of the initiative. So the activities refer to the services you're providing. It could be educational services, health screenings, whatever whatever the type of grant you're conducting. Then related to that are outputs, right? So we have inputs, activities, right? Outputs. And outputs are what we refer to those as the direct product of the activities. When you do an activity and run some sort of activity, what happens? Like, what do you see happening right away, immediately, right? So if you have inpatient psychoeducational groups running, and the psychologists, a lot of the examples I give are just by default are psychology related, although most of the grants I work on are not related to psychology, but a fair number are. But so you run those groups, the outputs would be the number of people attending, the number of sessions, number of weeks, number of hours per week, right? Perhaps their level, like how much they like those sessions, their level of satisfaction, patient experience. Those are the outputs. So then, and the last bit is outcomes or impacts. Sometimes people use that term. And then in grants, they'll also refer to those as objectives. There's a lot of terms there that they throw around. But in a typical logic model, be outcomes, and then sometimes people will break it down by short, intermediate, and long term, just depending what makes sense. And outcomes are really just the point, like why you're doing the project, like the whole point of it. Like if you have, like can you think of a project that you've worked on or consulted on, or someone's had a question about, in terms of like some sort of impact that they've, some sort of activity or intervention that you've worked on or heard about recently? And we can lay out what those different elements are.
Yeah, that would be great. Okay, so somebody in one of my grant training right now, she has a program where she serves low to moderate income single mothers, right? And they have different supportive services. So if she was looking at, she's looking at like a GED service for helping one individual get a GED, helping another get, more workforce, the financial literacy, et cetera. So the inputs then would be the resources, maybe the money from the grant, right? Maybe financial literacy partners if you have them, right? And then
The staff,
the staff,
yeah.
right? And then
Location, any technology that's being used to like facilitate the training, right? All that stuff, right?
okay, and yes, yeah, and then the next point you said would be the actual so you have the inputs, sorry, the resources, and then you have the next step is what?
The activities, yeah, like what you're actually going to do. Yeah, yeah.
So she would say, like, how would she say that then, is the activities?
Yeah, it depends like how granular you would get. So, but you mentioned some of the services that that they would provide, right? So there was, you said there was it like financial, did I hear that right? Financial literacy.
Financial literacy training.
So that would be maybe one module. You could list that as one activity. So sometimes you get sort of very granular and break it down a little bit more. Other times you bring it. It just depends like what's included in the overall program, the entire intervention. So what else is included in there?
GED support. So maybe we could also have like transportation, right? Or workforce placement, right? Workforce training development. So those different things then you could all put as activities, right?
Yeah, exactly. Those would be different activities that ultimately support like, the need of the target population. And, everything is like in the context of the need of the target population. Sometimes in logic models, I should say, and they'll sometimes specify this, like there's one that I saw recently where they said that they will also want the need listed, sort of like a contextual sort of factors. And that would be like important, right? What is the problem? What's the issue that you're addressing, right? Fundamentally. So let me ask you, what is the issue? This will make it even more crystal clear for us. But like, what do you remember what the issue was that they're trying to address in the target population?
Yeah, I think the main problem statement would be that low to moderate income single mothers in this certain area in Georgia have a higher poverty rate, or it might be something in that realm, right? They have lower income jobs as well. So looking at that's a huge problem. So then some of those activities to help solve that are financial literacy, education as far as the GED support, getting workforce placement, that sort of thing. So so when you look at, and I love that you say ground it with a problem statement, right? Ground it with that, and then you're seeing, okay, how are we solving this problem, right? And that ties into your goal and your objectives and all of that. So we looked at that problem statement, then these activities are clearly on point to help have a different outcome, right? To change that.
Yeah, you want the activities to be set up in such a way that they're going to ultimately result in outcomes that will address it makes sense, right? The problem that's experienced by the target population. So if you have a low number of like sort of low like high school completion as an issue, then GED courses, would make sense, right? So that would be an important aspect, I think, of the project. And then so that would be like one of the activities, right? The educational aspect, high school completion, or at least the GED, right? Something like that. And then outputs for that would be like the number of people that would be served by the project. It would be how many so for the GED, like, and it might vary, right, by the service that you're providing. Maybe you'd have a certain number that would participate in the GED aspect, and would that go for the GED piece? Would that go for 3 months? Would it go for 6 months? So you provide some detail around that. Again, when someone's looking at this one-page visual description, they can look at it, glance at it, and they can start to see the key elements of the program.
Yeah. So so each 10 people served or 10 people receiving their GEDs. Then you could have like under other activities, you could have 3 people in workforce placed through the workforce placement, attended 10 different trainings, right? All of that. So you could put all of the tangible.
How long are that's right. How long are the trainings? Those kind of things as well. Yeah.
Cool. So then moving on to the next thing would be the outcomes, and I love that you talked about outputs and outcomes. Sometimes people think they're interchangeable. Sometimes grants can get it confused, but really what that is the behavior change, right? Is how I kind of look at it. Like, what is the impact? As you mentioned, outcomes can sometimes be called impacts. So now we see the number of people that got a GED. How does that serve them? How does that even reduce that problem statement more, right? Like, how does that really reach your goal? So can you kind of talk about what some of the outcomes might be for those outputs?
Yeah, yes. The outputs are what happens when you run your, the different services that we're talking about in our example. What happens immediately. You see that you serve the people, they show up for 10 sessions, each one's an hour long. They, whatever it is, there tends to be some numbers associated with that, right? When we're describing the direct product of those activities. The outcomes are like the whole reason why you're doing the program. And sometimes there's some short-term outcomes that need to be achieved in order to get to that whole big reason, like the big point of why you're doing this. Like if you want individuals ultimately to get out of poverty and better jobs, like that might be like the ultimate kind of thing that we're trying to address and move the needle on and really impact. But perhaps in order to get there, we have to improve the level of education. We have to improve high school completion rate, right? We have to, maybe there's some vocational career counseling and having a better sense of type of job or occupation that they would like to pursue. So having changing perceptions, changing knowledge, changing behavior. These are typically the kind of like outcomes, things that we want to target and we want to improve. But it all comes back to then you're probably more long-term outcomes would be the directly aligned with the needs of your target population.
Yeah.
The other reason why logic models are helpful, even if they're not required, what it will do is it will force the grant team to really, sometimes things get unspoken, like they're not really said, and there's just a lot of assumptions made. But sitting down, and it could be on Zoom, it could be like done electronically in a number of ways, or just in a room together, sitting down and putting to paper visually what a program is and what the things we want to move the needle on, what those outcomes are, can be super elucidating. They could be really insightful. And when you go through that process, like a lot of times we'll find that like different people in the organization or even the grant writer and the organization, that they are understanding the project a little bit differently or very differently. Also, you can see like a lack of alignment sometimes between the activities and the outcomes. So it's like we have these great outcomes listed, but when you look at the activities, it doesn't really make sense. There isn't this like total consistency between the activities and the outcomes. So really like questioning that and coming back, it's like, okay, we have these couple outcomes here, but there's really nothing being done to address them. We have wishful thinking, which is great in a sense, but only if like it leads to us coming up with some pragmatic, real, ideas here about activities that we can add that will address those outcomes, all of the outcomes, or we adjust the outcomes. Sometimes you remove outcomes because you realize that they're not necessarily relevant. They sound good, but they're not super relevant, super core to what we plan to do, and what also maybe what the grant wants too.
Yeah,
what the opportunity wants.
I love that, because I actually know some grant writers who like to do the logic model first, right? And then, like you're saying, you kind of brainstorm and you kind of figure this out. And because it's giving you all of the framework of what needs to go into the grant, and they like to actually hang it up, like boom, put that picture up next to while they're writing the grant so they don't get lost in the weeds. And so they make sure that they're hitting on all of those points. So even if they don't have to incorporate that logic model into the grant, or they can't, right, because of the space limitation and all of that, they still do it just because there's so much benefit, like you're talking about, in doing the process of creating a logic model. And it really does help keep you, because I like having the logic model, like you said, I like having the problem statement there, the goal there, and having it so it's a whole like ecosystem as far as looking at the whole entire process, right, of what the grant will do for the community or for your target demographic, how it's going to really benefit. So it is a nice, even to have it as a standalone, it really is important to do, I think, but yeah, that's why I like how you kind of like said, the process even is enlightening.
And in general, like when you look, like I tell my students when I show them the different logic models we've worked on, I'm like, you probably think that this took us like maybe an hour or two to develop. Like, it doesn't look, it looks pretty simple, straightforward, and like I'll share some with you, and again for the blog post or for because we're talking about something that's very visual, so it'll be helpful for
Thank
the
you.
viewer or the listener to look at that.
Mm-hmm.
But really, like it takes, a good one will take many hours, and many hours, like people hours, because just the number of people that will have to collaborate and like figure out, oh yeah, this doesn't really make sense. There's really no, like conceptually it doesn't make sense that this activity will lead to this outcome. And there's this sort of notion, we speak in an evaluation language and program design language about a theory of change, that it should make sense from a theoretical perspective, from a conceptual model perspective, that the outcome, that the activities that you've laid out, that they'll result in the activities the outcomes you'll propose. Sorry, I keep mixing up the terms. The activities that you lay out, that there'll be conceptual consistency between the activities and the outcomes.
Yeah.
And again, it sounds pretty straightforward and it makes a lot of sense, I think.
Yeah.
But when you really dig into it, you can see that a lot of times there's big assumptions that are made. Mm-hmm. And assumptions can lead us, to I think make some real, conceptual and practical errors. So.
Absolutely, I agree with you. I've been in those meetings where it's definitely, it takes a while. There's a lot of different contribution and insight, and does that really make sense? And it can go on for quite a while. But the thing is once you get it nailed down and it's, you're like, this is it, and everyone comes to this agreement in it, then the other parts, such as writing the evaluation section, such as writing the narrative part of the grant, is so much easier, and it comes by, it moves faster, right? Because all of a sudden you have a framework to rely on, and you have something you can continually go back to. These are always the objectives, these are the activities, you know what I mean? So you can go back to it again and again. So it actually saves you time in the long run, even if it does take a little bit of time to really develop. And like you said, it's just a one-page visual sheet. It looks so simple, but it really is powerful. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So kind of segueing then into that, because in your practice and in your, your university practice as well, like looking at the evaluation section is where you also thrive, and connecting the logic model then to, if there isn't a section in a grant that says, how will you evaluate your deliverables, right? And there should always be, even if it's not, a 5-page part of a federal application, even if it's a foundation application and it's very short, you should always in your mind know how we're going to evaluate or measure the deliverables that we say we're going to do, right? So how can you use a logic model then to lay the groundwork for your evaluation section? Because I see a lot of people get stuck in the evaluation section, and how do I evaluate that this is going to get done or lead to the outcome that I want it to?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm just shutting down my as many things as I can because my internet says it's unstable.
Oh no.
So hopefully we'll be okay. Yeah, they're really, it matches up. It's a good segue, I think, to what you're asking, the logic model and kind of creating the evaluation, because you can use what you've developed from the logic model then to identify the different pieces that give you that help you do the evaluation. A lot of times in these grants, they're talking specifically about like process evaluation or outcome evaluation. Those are the two things that they're focusing on. And when they talk about the outcome evaluation, they're directly or indirectly referring to like coming up with like a sense of like what the value of the program is, like the value part of evaluation, the core part of that word, right? Determining what Michael Scriven referred to as the merit worth significance of the program, right? But a lot of times we'll do that by specifically measuring let's say the outcomes that are key, that are maybe what you report as part of your GIPRA or other different requirements, your quarterly QPR that you'll be doing, quarterly progress report, like different elements that you'll report on. You'll oftentimes have to report on those specific outcomes. And so for our example, and then you'll have to operationalize those outcomes, meaning measure those outcomes and report on that, track it, and come up with a way that makes sense to assess those outcomes. So for your example, when we're talking about better jobs, like ultimately, that's one of the things you want to see the participants get from that project, like improved jobs. Well, if you list that as an outcome, how do you measure that? Like, how do you know if something is a better job? So, obviously, like, people think about salary as one measure. It's not the only one, and it might not be the most important one. But you have to think about like how to operationalize that idea of better job. Right. So how do we measure that? So you could say, okay, it's salary. That's perhaps one way. There may be the benefits. Maybe it's maybe there's some other measures that I'm not familiar with that have to do with satisfaction, meaningfulness.
Flexibility.
I'm not sure.
Schedule, right? We're looking
flexibility. Yeah, there's probably other characteristics about mobility.
Yeah.
As we talk about it, I think we could come up with others, but for simplicity's sake, we could say like salary, as one way. And so you would, that's the way that in which you would, measure that. So you list out your outcomes, they're stated in your logic model, and then you propose different ways to measure each of those outcomes. And there's different ways to do that, right? You can, sometimes you get the data, it's like more programmatic data. Other times it might be from asking surveys, if you want to, using surveys to request the participants complete those surveys. For instance, if your target is to improve life satisfaction, let's say, right, well-being, something like that. A survey could be a good way to get at that, and to actually get at that in a more quantifiable way, where you have where you can actually get quantitative data. Numbers like scale scores that can give you an indication of, are they improving in their life, let's say life satisfaction, their quality of life. There's any number of things that we might be interested in that you could get at. That's another way to operationalize. And there's these outcomes that we're talking about, and you can use different tools to do that. And then in your grant proposal, you'll also provide detailed information about like the procedures you'll go through in order to do that. Like, who will collect the data? How will the data be analyzed? How will it be interpreted? What are the targets? Like what do we want to achieve, right, on the different criteria? So what sort of standard or level do we want to score at or achieve, or how much of an improvement are we hoping for? Oftentimes percent improvements are what's used in federal grants, which have their own set of challenges and kind of like setting a reasonable improvement, but nonetheless, that's oftentimes used. So the logic model can help you to identify key things that you'll want to measure, right? And that oftentimes will be the things that you need to report on, certainly with outcomes.
Yeah.
And the outputs and the activities too, that's like the more like the process kind of evaluation piece, where we would actually keep track of and report on number of participants that are served, number of participants that complete the program, right? That might be an additional measure. There's those kind of things, and perhaps something like satisfaction with the program. We want people to be satisfied with the program, not because that's an outcome. It's not really an outcome. I would say it's an output, but because increased satisfaction leads to better engagement, tends to then lead to ultimately to better outcomes, right? People are happier with the program, they participate, they they feel like it was valued, they experience it, engage, and they really stay with the program, the intervention, and it impacts the outcomes better. So laying all of that out can give you a good sense of what we should include in the evaluation plan. The evaluation plan is basically a detailed indication of what your outcomes are. You start with actually evaluation questions, which could refer to outcomes. Like an evaluation question might be like, to what extent were occupation quality, I could restate that, but was occupation quality improved by the program, by the workforce program, or whatever it was. As one example, the evaluation plan is guided by several evaluation questions. Within those would be, let's say, outcomes. And then we have the different ways in which you measure those outcomes. We have the way you analyze that, like all the different sort of pieces that we need to engage in. Yeah. So, there's a lot there, but it's very systematic. And when you see it kind of listed out, I think it can be helpful. Yeah.
Right. And I love that, because you guys may be like, oh my gosh, I'm going to do this, this, and this, but really when you put it together, it can be very simple. And I always say simple is better, as far as you don't need high sophisticated programs like software to do this. It's just really using, what do we need to do? Who is it going to impact? How many people? What's that effect going to be on them? How is that going to be a positive thing? Is that going to, flip the problem statement around, right, to make it the goal? And then how are we just going to track that all of this is getting done? Who's going to track it? You know what I mean? Like, where's the data stored? Simple things like it might be like the program manager is going to upload into the cloud in an Excel sheet. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't have to be crazy either. It can be simple. Yeah. But answering those questions, it shows the grant reviewers that you have a plan, right? And that they know what deliverables you're going to be reporting on and what type of increase or benefit it's going to, have. So when they're giving you money, they can directly tie money to that, to be like, $100,000 then is then going to serve 10 people, 3 people are going to get a GED, 4, 5, and 7 people are going to get job placement, and they're going to have an increased salary, increased job satisfaction. This is really going to help low to moderate single mothers improve their quality of life, right? So it just all ties together. And that's what I love about how you're outlaying, like, these are different methods and metrics then where you can show that, right? And that's technical writing. So yeah,
definitely. Yeah, and it really just like forces you to also like be very deliberate about how you're going to, let's say, collect the data.
Yeah.
So if you have as your outputs and there the number of sessions that people attend of a particular training in order to be completers, then you need to track that. So that should be included in your CRM if you use one, or it should be included in the system that you develop, because you're going to need to have one to track that, to ultimately report if somebody is not just attending, but if they're completing the program by maybe completing 80% of the sessions, or doing whatever it is that makes them a completer of the program. So it forces you specifically to indicate like how you're going to collect, track, maintain the information that you're going to need to get. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that can lead to obviously higher rates of securing grants because you're showing this. And also the big thing, of course, is how higher rates of completing these projects and having amazing outcome and positive outcome in your communities, right? When you have these types of plans, because if you don't have something set up, like who's going to do what, how is this really going to happen? What is the real outcome we're looking for? And you get money, say you get funded, then it might be hard to manage that money because you're really not sure how to do it, you know what I mean? Because you don't know what you're really doing. So it really all ties together with completing the logic model, and then with having an evaluation methodology in place on how you're going to handle all of the data, how you're going to track everything, right? And how you're going to report on everything. So yeah, really, really good.
Yeah, definitely. I'll share with you also. I did I think last week, a webinar for this conference, Future is Mindful, the post-conference event. We did a webinar, and it was titled Determining the Impact of Your Mindfulness Program, right? Mm-hmm. And so I walked people through like how to do this, how to kind of go through the steps that we're talking about, creating basically how to figure out like the impact, what the effect of your mindfulness program. A lot of organizations are running mindfulness programs. Mostly a lot of for-profits were at this, I think, represented at the conference. And so they have to, just like everyone, have to justify their efforts, the money spent, the time spent, and so forth. How do we do that? How do we show like what the impact of our efforts is? And in this case, so I walk people through specifically like a program that we ran, and how developed the logic model for it, what we did, and then we go through some like specific steps of applying an evaluation, another like evaluation tool, a model called the Context Input Process Product Model, developed initially by Dan Stufflebeam, and they came out with a book with Gilly Zhang as well. That's a fantastic book that I'm going to be using in one of my evaluation courses actually very soon. And so we take that approach and apply it, and the logic model, and apply that to determining the impact of a mindfulness program. We did that with our program. Mm-hmm. And so so I'll provide a link to that video.
Great.
It's available. Yeah.
Yes. Awesome. Well, thank you so much again for coming on and shedding more light and more insight and more detail on logic models, on evaluation sections in grants and for grants. This has been really, really helpful. And I know a lot of people are also going to be wanting to download those downloadables that you're talking about. They'll be sharing with us and going to those links. So I'll definitely be sharing that in the show notes. But as far as people wanting to reach out to you, you're a professor at Nova Southeastern University in Miami, and you also have your own practice, the Eval Network. So how can people reach out to you, and where can they find you?
Yeah, they can find me on LinkedIn. I'll share the link, the username, whatever. We'll put that in there. And also they can email me directly. So they can email me at jpann@avalnetwork.com. So those are probably like two good ways to do that. But LinkedIn is also the direct messaging, and LinkedIn is good too. So
great. So any questions they have on sections, they can reach out to you on the evaluation. Yeah, and then you can get back to them. So thank you for providing this service. And you also have your own podcast, and you want to talk about it a little bit before we sign off today?
Yeah, it's called the Val Network. So I've interviewed you before on there, all sorts of people from in evaluation, work in the nonprofit space. So we do that, and it's a lot of fun. And I just use it for the work I do with my students, to share it with the evaluation community and the grant writing community, and it's just a great excuse to speak to really interesting people. So that's fun.
Awesome.
The videos with that, and a lot of what we talked about today, I think will be like really helpful when folks see the like the visual part. A lot of this is visual. We're talking about it. It's a bit of a struggle talking about something that's has a visual component, but without having the visual piece. But once you look at like sort of an example of the logic model, when you look at maybe the video where I walk through that, and that maybe that will be helpful for the readers. So yeah.
Absolutely. So we'll have all those links in the show notes. Absolutely. Yeah. So thank you so much again for coming on the Grant Writing and Funding podcast and shedding more light on logic models and evaluation sections. And we'll be sure to have you back on the podcast again. And I'll also have the links from your prior episodes as well. So thank you again, Dr. James Pann. Appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, Holly.